This video discusses sexual violence in media in a way that requires showing certain explicit scenes. While I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum and put warnings in front of the worst of it, and I'll provide plenty of eye bleach in the form of cute animals between all of that, be aware that some of what you're about to see may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. That's not the way that I wanted to lead into a discussion of Goblin Slayer. I'm pretty sure that content warning alone is going to invalidate my opinion for at least some of the show's biggest fans. First impressions are everything, and I wish that I could be making a different one. I also wish that Goblin Slayer didn't need to have a content warning in front of it on Crunchyroll. I wish that I could be making a video about fun, creative D&D kills, or the psychology of an obsessive anti-hero protagonist, or the potential for a resurgence of dark fantasy that this show, along with Overlord and Re:Zero, is facilitating. And yet, here we are. Because first impressions are everything, and for a lot of people, myself included, Goblin Slayer left an awful one. On watching the first episode, I said the series was repugnant and edgy and felt like it was written by a 14-year-old, and I regret that tweet. Having read the manga and light novel and seen a few more episodes, I think it's unfair to the work as a whole and to the series writer. Goblin Slayer is a fun, pulpy, schlocky adventure about a plate-armored psycho bending the rules of the RPG world he lives in to massacre trash mobs in the most imaginative, efficient, and often entertaining ways possible. It's a show that highlights the absurd creative potential of tabletop role-playing and marries it to the gleeful murder lust of games like Doom and Hitman. Overall, it's not repugnant. But its first episode is, and that largely comes down to one awful, ill-conceived, poorly justified, and exploitative rape scene that I think is as bad as, if not worse than, the infamously awful scene from the end of Sword Art's Fairy Dance arc. Today, I'm going to lay out the problems with that scene's concept and execution and dig into the issues with the anime adaptation that created them. And because I know that not everyone agrees that the scene is a problem in the first place, I'm also going to try to explain why I think it's detrimental to the series overall. So in case you don't know how Goblin Slayer starts, the series opens with a young priestess signing up to become an adventurer and joining a party of other newbies on a goblin killing quest as a healer. They go into the goblin's lair woefully unprepared and are quickly overwhelmed and then die, except for the priestess, who makes a swift retreat and is rescued by the titular hero Goblin Slayer at the last second, and the fighter, who is brutally beaten and raped. Because in this universe, that's how goblins reproduce. This is meant to show that goblins are dangerous and make us hate them as much as our heroes do, or at least understand why they need to be killed so badly. And it arguably does that, but the way it goes about doing it is cheap and exploitative. The scene makes us as an audience feel upset, but it doesn't do so by hurting a character that it's made us care about, or cutting off a potentially interesting and fun storyline before it can begin, or doing any of the other things that well-written stories do to earn their readers' reactions. All it does is take something from the real world that is already inherently upsetting and put it in front of us, saying, "Look at this, feel bad." And it doesn't even do a good job of that, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That is, to put it nicely, really fucking lazy. It's the writing equivalent of a jump scare, or of focusing the camera on a puddle of gore, a cheap tactic for getting a totally unearned reaction out of your audience. And while using shortcuts to move people early in a story when they're not inherently invested isn't a bad thing on its own, specifically using sexual violence, which is both a hot-button issue and a source of trauma for hundreds of thousands of people, is at best crass and tasteless. Because, frankly, there are plenty of other horrible real-world things that could elicit the same reaction without that baggage. If the goblins were to, say, shove their knives in a box of puppies, or stick their dicks in a box of puppies, we'd be equally disgusted with them, equally inclined to hate them. And it would have just as much of an impact on the rest of the story as killing off and traumatizing a pack of nameless prop characters. If you're going to devote significant time to sexual assault in a story, especially right at the start, you need to make sure that it's an essential component of that story, that it changes your characters, alters the future course of events, or at least lets you say something meaningful that you otherwise couldn't. Psycho Pass offers an example of how this can be done right, as its first episode also involves sexual violence. Specifically, the episode's villain kidnaps a woman named Shika Shimizu and starts doing every horrible thing he's ever imagined doing to her because the Sybil system has flagged him as a latent criminal and he figures his life is over anyway, so he may as well enjoy it. The twist is, when our heroes kill him and rescue Chica, she's so traumatized and stressed out from what she's just been through that the Sybil system picks up on her mental instability and deems her a latent criminal as well. Meaning, right after they save her, the officers have to kill or at least arrest her. This whole plotline is meant to highlight the horrifying flaws in the Sybil system, how it encourages criminal activity and makes no effort to distinguish between unstable criminals and traumatized victims. And that message is amplified by showing Chica going through one of the worst kinds of trauma imaginable, making us entirely sympathetic to her plight. Threatening a box of puppies or even subjecting Chica to a lesser crime would change the outcome and meaning of the story. So I think that using sexual assault as a plot point there is justified in a way that Goblin Slayer's use of it simply isn't. At least, not in the anime. But both the light novel and the manga turn the faceless party of adventurers who accompany Priestess into actual, characters. In the light novel, before each of them dies, the narration shifts to their perspective, giving us a bit of insight into who they are and how they think. The mage is annoyed by Priestess's constant worrying, for instance, while the fighter is in love with the warrior and finds herself heartbroken to watch him die. In the manga, each of them is given a one-page flashback where we learn that the warrior was a poor farm boy who picked up some big dreams listening to tales from other adventurers. The mage was a spell-casting prodigy destined for great things. And the fighter was the daughter of a martial arts master who wanted to honor her father's legacy by saving people. It's as thin as characterization gets, but it's still characterization. It tells us who these characters are and who they could have been. In a different world with less rapey goblins, these characters could have been proper heroes in their own right. The warrior could have been Dragon Quest's Erdrick. But in this bleak world, that story is cut short before it could ever begin. This small bit of character building adds a tragic element that's not there in the anime and makes this scene upsetting for reasons other than just because the goblins did an inherently bad thing in front of us. Kumo Kagyu, the series author, does something to earn that reaction. And it's better than the nothing the anime gives us. Now, this level of characterization doesn't really justify how gratuitous the anime or manga are, but it's perfectly appropriate for the way the novel handles the scene. Which leads us to the bigger problem with the anime, the way that it sexualizes this violence, treating what's supposed to be a traumatic, scary moment as dimly lit fan service, and undermining its own message in the process. Now, whether or not something is sexualized is, to some extent, a subjective question, one that requires making assumptions about both a work's author and its intended audience. For example, all of these shots of feet seem pretty innocuous and innocent until you realize they're all from Quentin Tarantino films, and Tarantino is a notorious, soul man, so to speak. Sorry if I just ruined Pulp Fiction for you, and if I made it better, I guess you're welcome. This subjective element means that any argument I make about Goblin Slayer's intent can be countered with, well, it's supposed to be horrifying, I don't see it as sexual, and if you do, that says more about what you're into than the show. So instead of that, I'm just going to focus on how the scene is shot and presented. Now, if I was talking about the manga, I don't think anyone in their right mind would argue that this panel from the same scene isn't sexualized. Fighter is impossibly contorting her spine in order to present both her ass and titties to the reader simultaneously. This was drawn into this supposedly horrifying tone-setting scene explicitly for the purpose of fan service. It's the definition of exploitative and a major black mark on a manga adaptation that has otherwise fantastic, moody artwork. Nothing in the anime so far has been anywhere near this overt, at least nothing that wasn't supposed to be fan service, which is good, but there are a lot of questionable choices in how this scene in particular is shot and animated. And this is where I've got to actually break down the scenes, so if you're worried about it, you can either look away from the screen for a bit or skip to this timestamp if you don't feel like you need the explanation. There are two shots in this sequence that I think send the wrong message and dilute the intent of this scene, assuming that the intent is, in fact, to disturb the audience and make us fear and hate the goblins. These shots leave way too little to the imagination to actually be frightening, which is a problem a lot of horror anime have, and they show a lot of skin in a way that's more provocative than it is disturbing. The first is this shot of the goblins tearing off Fighter's clothes. Obviously, if you're going to show this kind of thing on screen, some amount of nudity is inevitable, but this is excessive in a way that frankly doesn't make much sense. These vicious little monsters are supposed to be aggressively dogpiling her, yet none of them are actually on top of her or even directly touching her. They're all tearing her clothes off from way off to the side, giving her a weird amount of personal space. This guy is a full 2 feet away from her. They're not really acting the way that you'd expect chaotic evil rape parasites to act. In theater and film, blocking is the art of positioning actors in a scene to serve a purpose or augment its meaning. Blocking helps directors to direct the viewer's eyes around the screen or stage, and by looking at a director's blocking choices, we can surmise a lot about the thought process behind a given scene or shot and what they want us to pay attention to. So, to come back to this shot, note how the blocking of these goblins conveniently makes it so that we never lose sight of Fighter's face, which means that we see the horror on it, but we also never lose sight of her thighs, her butt when she flips over, or her breasts. This other goblin is actively crouching down specifically so that the camera can always see her boobs in every frame over the top of his head. He even awkwardly rips her clothes away from himself when she turns in order to keep a thin strip of cloth over her crotch so that the show can show more skin without delving into the realm of hentai. He's so considerate. This is, to be frank, the kind of blocking you'd expect to see in hentai, not a horror movie. And I know because I watch a lot of horror movies, and even more hentai. The only thing that the director should be cheating toward the camera here is her face so that the audience can better empathize with her. Everything else is gratuitous. The same applies to the shot where she's pressed down on the ground in the face down, ass up position. There's no good reason for the goblins to all be standing off to the side, framing her entire naked body and the curve of her back for the camera. But they are. Having them all crowded together in an orderly fashion actively takes away from the impression that these monsters are swarming around her, because for some reason, whoever storyboarded this scene thought that it was really important we have an unobstructed view of her backside as the goblin tears her panties off. The camera pans away from that to better show off her butt and the face of the goblin behind her, but as it's the only light-colored object in the frame, her ass is the most eye-catching thing on the screen here by far. That's kinda filmmaking 101, and I would be genuinely surprised if a professional animator did that unintentionally. Take that first shot out, and take the pan out of the second one, and suddenly the scene is a lot more unambiguously frightening. The shots of Fighter's head being stepped on and the goblin's fingers tearing into her skin tell the story of what's happening effectively enough on their own, and absent the context of those two hentai angles, they actually feel more creepy and disorienting. Now, I do think there's more that could be done to increase the horror factor here, like having the goblins swarm more violently and chaotically and using more creative angles, but I'm not gonna turn this into a whole video essay on effective horror camera work. That's not the point. The point is, this right here is bad filmmaking, in part because it's gratuitous and excessive, in part because it's exploitative and cheaply written, but mostly because it muddies the intent of the scene and makes it less frightening. It could be so much more effective without these shots in it. And not to sound like a broken record, but the original light novel doesn't have this problem. There's no explicit description of Fighter's body or the goblin's actions. It says enough that you know what's happening, but that's it. It leaves the details to your imagination. The scene is still plenty frightening, but because of the violence and loss of life, not the shock value. Even after that breakdown, I'm sure this scene doesn't bother some of you. Maybe it even works as intended, and look, we can argue back and forth over whether or not it serves a legitimate narrative purpose or is filmed well. I think it fails on both counts, and I've made my case as to why. But if you're a Goblin Slayer fan and you disagree, that's okay. You're not a rape apologist, a hypocrite, or an edgelord, and unless you're typing a threatening or abusive comment right now, you're probably not an asshole. Anyone who makes that kind of judgment based on the anime that you like needs to get their head out of their asses. That said, there is still a reason that even you, as a person who really loves Goblin Slayer and just wants to see it build up a huge fandom, as someone who's upset to see me make a video that might discourage my audience from getting into it, should still be concerned about the presentation of this scene. Because it's not just a matter of taste or fortitude, it's a matter of accessibility. The way Goblin Slayer handles sexual assault has already made a huge chunk of people decide not to watch it, and while some are simply offended by the content and presentation, which is still, to be crystal clear, a perfectly valid reason to dislike a show, others have a bigger problem. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is a medical condition that can cause victims to suffer anxiety attacks or emotional breakdowns when reminded of traumatic events. Depictions of similar events in film in particular, since the inclusion of sound and motion makes it much more vivid and intense, have a higher chance of triggering these reactions. About 5% of adults in America suffer from PTSD, and alongside military experience and car accidents, sexual assault is one of the leading causes. So a significant number of people cannot sit through episode 1 of Goblin Slayer without risking a severe traumatic reaction. The show in its entirety is effectively unwatchable for them, and that sucks. Especially because that barrier to entry doesn't even need to exist in the first place. It's not there in the novel, and it doesn't have to be there or be this bad in the anime. I've seen a few people call episode 1's rape scene a normie filter, meant to weed out people who can't handle it, but many people, sometimes those same people, also jump to point out that Goblin Slayer isn't really about rape. It's about goofy D&D antics with high stakes, intense violence, and a dark edge. It's Doom meets Batman meets Tolkien. And while that's definitely not for everyone, there is nothing about Goblin Slayer's core appeal as a series that should require someone be able to stomach graphic depictions of sexual violence to enjoy it. So why is that the first thing a new viewer needs to get past in order to watch the show? Maybe that doesn't bother you. Maybe you could care less if anyone else enjoys the series. Maybe you think it's a good thing that some people can't, and you don't want to share your fandom with people who don't share your values. I'm not going to pretend I understand that mindset, but it is what it is. That said, if you do think that way, maybe stop going on Twitter tirades against people who criticize the show, because they're kinda doing both you and the people you don't want to watch the show a favor. But for the rest of you out there, the hardcore Goblin Slayer fans who just want to see the community around the series grow, want it to be recognized for its better qualities, and want it to make a lot of money so that more of the series gets adapted and more shows like it get made, please, don't let defending this one scene be the hill that you die on. Instead of acting like nothing's wrong with it or like people are wrong to be upset about it, acknowledge that it's a bad first episode, or at least a potentially offensive one, and try to draw people's attention to the parts of the series that you think they'll actually like. The creative kills, the lore, the endearing moments where someone's just having a random conversation and Gobslay-san pops up like, did someone say goblins? Maybe direct friends to check out the novel instead of the anime. I actually highly recommend that. It's a really good read, and the anime's got other problems like horribly out of place CGI that the novel doesn't suffer from. Or if you know that they'd still rather watch something than read something, tell them to skip the first episode, because there's not really much in it that isn't reiterated in a more effective and tasteful way by episode 4. And on top of that, be understanding that some people still won't want to give it a chance. One bad scene or episode shouldn't define an otherwise good anime, but for some people, it will. Think of it this way. Imagine your favorite video essay of mine, or if you don't like my channel, your favorite video essay of Super Eye Patch Wolves. Now imagine that video essay is exactly the same in every single way, but I started it by saying, "What's up, my N-words," with like a hard R. Understandably, some people would be really upset about that and not able to see past it to enjoy the rest of what is otherwise a good video. And that is a fine position to take. Everyone has a line that they don't want media to cross, and it is perfectly legitimate to draw that line here. There is no need to hurl abuse at people who don't like the show, and no need for them to hurl it back at people who do. I know that was a lot of talking to ultimately land on sometimes you just got to agree to disagree, but hopefully I've managed to strip away some of the hyperbole, including what I myself have perpetuated around this series, and helped some of you to understand what all the fuss is about. And for anyone watching this who's part of the fuss, because I'm pretty sure half of this video's views will come from me preaching to the choir, maybe give the series a second chance, especially if you enjoy tabletop role-playing or dark fantasy. I did, and once I got past the repugnant stuff, I had a good time watching it. And hopefully, I'll be able to have a good time making a less serious video about the series before the season is over. But there's a lot of other great anime still left to talk about, so let me know in the comments below what other anime from this season you most want to see me cover, and what aspects of Goblin Slayer you'd like to see me put under my analytical lens, and we'll see what happens before the end of the year. And while you're down there, don't forget to hit the like button if you like the video, and hit the subscribe button if you want to see more videos from Mother's Basement every week from now until I don't know, the goblins invade. I don't have a joke for this one. I'm Geoff Thew, professional shitbag, signing out from my mother's basement.